What if a king was so obsessed with proving his greatness that he decided to build a bridge of ships across an entire sea? He gathered the largest army the world had ever seen, convinced that no one could stand in his way. His pride was so immense that he believed sheer numbers alone would bring him victory. But what happens when arrogance blinds a ruler to simple geography, strategy, and the will of a small but determined enemy? This is the story of King Xerxes and his march into Greece, where his overconfidence led him to one of history's most famous blunders. In 480 BC, Xerxes I of Persia commanded an empire that stretched from modern-day India to Egypt, the largest empire the world had ever known. With vast wealth and millions under his rule, Xerxes saw himself not only as a king, but almost as a god. He inherited from his father, Darius the Great, the desire to punish Greece for daring to resist Persian power. Darius had begun the campaign, but died before he could finish it. Xerxes now took up that mission with unmatched ambition. He was determined not only to defeat the Greeks, but to crush them so thoroughly that no one would ever challenge Persia again. His preparations were extraordinary. Ancient sources like Herodotus describe an army so vast it shook the earth when it marched. While these numbers were likely exaggerated, Xerxes still commanded a massive host, possibly hundreds of thousands of soldiers. They came from every corner of his empire: archers from Persia, cavalry from Central Asia, infantry from Mesopotamia, and even levies from as far away as Egypt and India. This was more than an army. It was a display of imperial power, meant to intimidate as much as to conquer. Xerxes' arrogance extended even to nature itself. To cross the Hellespont, the narrow strait that separates Asia from Europe, he ordered a bridge of ships to be built. When storms destroyed it, he flew into a rage and famously commanded his men to whip the sea as punishment, as though the elements themselves should bow to his will. Then he ordered a stronger bridge constructed, and his army marched across, entering Europe in a spectacle meant to inspire awe. Xerxes believed that nothing could resist him, not men, not cities, and certainly not nature. But for all his power, Xerxes had little respect for the enemy he faced. Greece was a collection of small, quarrelsome city-states divided by rivalries and jealousies. To a ruler like Xerxes, it must have seemed laughable that such tiny polities could pose a real threat to his empire. Athens and Sparta were famous, yes, but they were small compared to the mighty Persian war machine. Xerxes assumed that numbers would carry the day, that overwhelming force would make resistance useless. It was a dangerous miscalculation. The Greeks, though divided, knew what was at stake. If Persia conquered them, their independence would vanish. Their culture smothered, and their cities turned into subject states of the empire. While many Greek states submitted, others chose defiance. Chief among them were Athens, with its powerful navy, and Sparta, with its unmatched warriors. These unlikely allies, so often rivals themselves, realized that unity was their only hope. They decided to make their stand not on open ground, where Persian numbers could crush them, but in a place where the size of the Persian army would become a liability instead of an advantage. That place was Thermopylae, a narrow pass between the mountains and the sea. It was little more than a choke point, where only a handful of soldiers could fight at once. For the Greeks, this was perfect. For Xerxes, it was a trap he walked into with full confidence. Too blinded by his pride to see the danger, Xerxes believed his massive army would sweep aside any resistance. But the geography of Thermopylae nullified his advantage. He had countless soldiers, but what use are countless soldiers if only a few can fight at a time? The Greeks understood this, and that is why they chose the pass. It was not just a battle of armies. It was a battle of planning, foresight, and understanding the terrain. The Persians would march in with overwhelming force, but their numbers would be turned against them. Xerxes was not the kind of ruler to question himself. In his mind, his enemies would fall simply because he demanded it. He underestimated not only Greek strategy, but Greek spirit. The Spartans in particular lived for war, trained from childhood to fight without fear. Their king Leonidas led a small force of Greeks, including his famous 300 Spartans, to hold the pass. To Xerxes, this must have seemed absurd. How could so few men stand against the greatest army in history? But Leonidas and his allies did not come expecting to win outright. They came to make a statement, to delay the Persians, and to prove that courage could defy overwhelming power. This arrogance on Xerxes' part is what makes Thermopylae such a legendary story. He had every advantage in numbers, wealth, and resources, yet he ignored the basics of military strategy. He assumed that fear of Persia would be enough to break Greek resistance. Instead, his hubris set the stage for one of history's greatest underdog stands. What makes Xerxes' mistake so striking is how easily it could have been avoided. A more cautious general might have scouted the terrain thoroughly, sought alternate routes, or even avoided the narrow pass entirely. But Xerxes was not interested in caution. He wanted spectacle, dominance, and proof that his power was absolute. Marching his massive army straight into Thermopylae seemed to him not a risk, but a demonstration of inevitable victory. Yet it would soon become the site of his most famous humiliation. This moment in history is not just about armies clashing, it is about the consequences of arrogance. Xerxes believed himself untouchable. He punished the sea for daring to destroy his bridge. He dismissed the Greeks as too small to matter, and he marched his army into a bottleneck without considering the possibility of resistance. All of it was driven by ego, by the need to prove that he, Xerxes, was destined to rule not just Asia, but all of Europe as well. But Thermopylae would show him otherwise. And that sets the stage for one of history's most legendary confrontations, where a few thousand Greeks would hold back the largest army the world had ever seen. Xerxes believed he had already won, but he was about to learn that size alone does not decide a battle. This has been part 1 of the story of Xerxes at Thermopylae. If you're enjoying this breakdown of history's biggest blunders, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historians so you don't miss the next part of the series. The narrow pass of Thermopylae was a natural choke point, a strip of land pressed between the mountains and the sea. At its tightest point, only a few soldiers could fight side by side. For an army as enormous as Xerxes, this was a fatal flaw. His strength was his size, his overwhelming numbers. But in a place where numbers could not be deployed all at once, that strength was stripped away. What remained was a slow, grinding battle, and on that ground, the Greeks, led by King Leonidas, had the advantage. Leonidas arrived with his famous 300 Spartans, but they were not alone. They were joined by several thousand allies from other Greek city-states. Still, compared to Xerxes' colossal army, this was a tiny force. To most observers, the Greeks looked suicidal. But Leonidas and his men understood the terrain. They knew that the narrow pass would funnel the Persians into a tight corridor, where only discipline and skill mattered. In such a place, the courage of a few could hold back the many. Xerxes, on the other hand, could not see the danger. He believed his numbers would crush the resistance almost instantly. His confidence was so great that, according to ancient accounts, he sent a messenger demanding the Greeks lay down their arms. Leonidas gave the famous reply, "Come and take them." It was not bravado for its own sake. It was a calculated signal to his men and to Greece as a whole. The Spartans would not bow. When the Persians advanced, their advantage in numbers melted away. Thousands could not fight at once. They were forced into the bottleneck, where the Greeks formed a wall of shields and spears. The Spartans in particular were masters of the hoplite phalanx, a tight formation where each man's shield protected the soldier next to him. Against this wall of bronze and discipline, the Persians found themselves struggling to break through. The Persians launched wave after wave of soldiers into the pass. Archers, infantry, and even elite troops, known as the Immortals all, were thrown against the Greeks. Yet the terrain ensured that every wave collided head-on with a handful of determined defenders. The Greeks rotated their men in and out, keeping them fresh, while the Persians bled strength with each charge. The battle quickly became less about numbers and more about stamina, training, and morale. The Spartans' training gave them a terrifying efficiency. From childhood, Spartan boys were raised to fight, hardened through the brutal system known as the agouge. They learned discipline, endurance, and loyalty to the phalanx. By the time they stood at Thermopylae, these were not ordinary men. They were professional warriors in the truest sense. For the Persians, who came from across the empire and had varied training and equipment, the Spartans must have seemed unstoppable. Herodotus tells us that the Persians were whipped into battle by their commanders to keep them charging forward. But still, they failed to break the line. The narrowness of Thermopylae also nullified the Persian cavalry, which was normally a devastating force in open ground. Horses could not maneuver in such a confined space. Archers could rain arrows, but the Greek shields and discipline allowed them to endure the volleys. Every advantage Xerxes thought he had was stripped away by the geography of that single pass. For days, the Greeks held firm. The Persians, frustrated and shocked, were unable to push through. The image of thousands of soldiers being stopped by a few hundred became a humiliation for Xerxes. He had marched the greatest army the world had ever seen into Greece, only to have them stalled by a wall of men blocking a narrow road. His belief in the inevitability of victory began to crack. The longer the Greeks held, the more symbolic the battle became. To the Greeks, it proved that courage and discipline could defy even the greatest empire on earth. To the Persians, it was a reminder that their king's arrogance had led them into a situation where sheer numbers counted for nothing. Xerxes had thought he would frighten the Greeks into submission. Instead, he was the one embarrassed on the battlefield. Leonidas' leadership was just as important as the terrain. He knew his men were outnumbered, but he kept them focused on the fight in front of them. He did not need to defeat the entire Persian army. He only needed to hold the line. Each day of resistance gave Athens more time to prepare its navy, and gave the rest of Greece more reason to resist Persia. The stand at Thermopylae was as much psychological as it was military. It showed the Greeks that Persia was not invincible. There is also the matter of Spartan discipline in retreat. Unlike many armies who might panic or flee when faced with overwhelming numbers, the Spartans were trained to hold their ground no matter what. Even when soldiers rotated, they did so in an orderly fashion, never allowing the Persian army to find a weak spot. It was a display of iron control that contrasted sharply with the chaos of the Persian assaults. Xerxes must have realized by the second or third day that he had underestimated the Greeks badly. His overwhelming force was being wasted in a place where it could not be applied, yet his arrogance made it impossible to withdraw. To retreat would be to admit weakness. So he kept pressing the attack, throwing away men in a battle he should never have fought on those terms. This was the fatal flaw of his strategy. He had believed that size alone determined victory. But at Thermopylae, size became his weakness. The longer the battle dragged on, the clearer it became that Xerxes had walked blindly into a trap laid by geography and exploited by Leonidas. The Spartans' reputation only grew with each passing hour. Stories circulated of their calm under fire, of warriors combing their hair before battle as though preparing for a festival. Such details, whether exaggerated or not, drove home the point. These men did not fear Xerxes' vast army. They welcomed the fight because they knew that here, in this narrow pass, they had the upper hand. What Xerxes thought would be a swift victory turned into a grinding stalemate. His soldiers were dying, his reputation was suffering, and his grand invasion was already faltering. The bottleneck of Thermopylae turned his greatest strength into a liability, and Leonidas made sure to take full advantage of it. This was no ordinary battle. It was a duel between pride and preparation, between arrogance and discipline. And for several crucial days, the pride of Persia was humbled by the defiance of a few thousand Greeks holding a strip of land no wider than a road. The clash at Thermopylae was not just a battle of numbers, it was a battle of two very different ways of war, two doctrines that had been shaped by centuries of experience and geography. On one side stood the Persians, masters of vast plains and open fields. Their armies built for sweeping maneuvers, fast-moving cavalry, and overwhelming missile fire. On the other side were the Spartans and their allies, bred for close combat, their very identity tied to the shield wall and the discipline of fighting shoulder to shoulder. When these two doctrines met in the narrow throat of Thermopylae, one was exposed as brittle and the other as unbreakable. The Persians had never been prepared for what awaited them. In their empire, battles were decided by mobility and numbers. Cavalry charges could shatter enemy lines, and endless streams of infantry could overwhelm opponents. Xerxes believed this same approach would crush the Greeks, but at Thermopylae, the ground itself betrayed him. The mountains and the sea squeezed his army into a single line of advance, where none of his advantages could be used. Cavalry had no room to maneuver. Archers could fire, but their arrows rattled harmlessly against Greek shields, or were endured by men who had long trained to fight under missile fire. For the Spartans, this was the perfect setting. The phalanx was not designed for open fields where flanks could be exposed. It was built for holding tight ground, for creating an iron wall that an enemy could not break. Every man's shield overlapped with the shield of his comrade. Every spear thrust forward through the narrow gaps. The formation was both offensive and defensive, a wall that stabbed. Inside it, discipline ruled. No one broke rank. No one tried to be a hero. The unit itself was the weapon, and at Thermopylae, that weapon was unstoppable. The Persians rushed forward in wave after wave. They were whipped into battle by their commanders, driven by fear of their king more than by hope of glory. Each wave crashed against the Greek wall and fell back broken. The narrow pass became a slaughterhouse. The Persians were packed too tightly to fight effectively. Their lighter shields and shorter weapons were useless against the longer spears of the hoplites. Many were killed without ever striking a blow. Those behind them, pressed forward by the sheer weight of the army, could not retreat and could barely breathe. The Spartans, by contrast, fought with cold precision. They advanced a step, thrust with their spears, killed, and fell back to let the next rank move forward. They rotated units in and out so that no one grew too tired. Their armor of bronze shields, helmets, and cuirasses protected them. While the Persians often wore little more than wicker shields and cloth tunics, in that confined space, the imbalance was staggering. One Spartan was worth many Persians, not because of any mythical power, but because of training, armor, and discipline. Even the immortals, Xerxes' elite guard, failed to break the line. These men were chosen for their strength and skill, but their weapons were no match for the long spears of the Greeks. Time and again they were pushed back, their reputation crumbling in front of their king. For Xerxes, watching from his throne, it must have been a bitter humiliation. He had proclaimed himself master of the world, ruler of an empire that stretched from India to Egypt. Yet here, in a rocky pass in Greece, he was watching his best soldiers cut down by a force that should have been insignificant. The humiliation deepened with every day that passed. The Persians were supposed to win quickly, to sweep aside resistance and terrify the Greeks into submission. Instead, they were losing men by the thousands, while the Spartans and their allies stood firm. Herodotus tells us that Persian bodies piled up in front of the Greek line, so many that the defenders used the corpses as a barricade. The battlefield itself became a monument to Xerxes' folly, a reminder that arrogance can blind even the mightiest ruler. The contrast between the two sides could not have been sharper. The Persians relied on sheer force and numbers, a doctrine that assumed the enemy would eventually break. The Spartans relied on endurance and cohesion, a doctrine that assumed no man had the right to break. When a Spartan died, his place was filled instantly by another. The line held. The army remained whole. It was not about the bravery of individuals, but about the discipline of the group. But bravery was there too, and in abundance. The Greeks fought with the knowledge that they were hopelessly outnumbered, that this stand might be their last. Yet that knowledge seemed to sharpen their courage. Leonidas himself moved among his men, not as a distant king, but as a commander, ready to fight and die with them. His presence made the phalanx more than a military formation, it became a symbol of defiance. The Persians, on the other hand, seemed to be fighting because they had no choice. They were driven forward by whips and orders. When they fell, others were pushed over their bodies to take their place. This was not bravery, but compulsion, and it showed. The Persians fought as individuals thrown into a crowd, while the Spartans fought as a single living machine. For Xerxes, the longer the battle dragged on, the clearer the folly of his invasion became. He had thought that fear alone would win. He had assumed that the Greeks would see the size of his army and surrender without resistance. Instead, they had chosen to resist in the one place where his army was weakest. The more he pressed, the more he exposed the weakness of his doctrine. The humiliation was not just military, but personal. Kings of Persia were not supposed to be defied. They were seen as godlike figures, their word law across the vast empire. For Xerxes to sit on his throne and watch his men die in heaps before a handful of Greeks was to strip away that aura of invincibility. His power was revealed as brittle. His strategy was revealed as folly. And worst of all, his arrogance was revealed to the world. The battlefield at Thermopylae was littered with proof of that folly. Persians armed for war on the plains of Asia lay dead in the narrow Greek pass, their armor shattered by bronze, their weapons broken against shields that did not yield. Each corpse was a reminder that Xerxes had walked blindly into a trap he could not escape. For the Spartans and their allies, every moment of resistance was a victory. They had shown that discipline and preparation could triumph over size and bluster. They had inflicted a wound not only on the Persian army, but on its king's pride. The pass of Thermopylae became a theater where bravery shamed arrogance, and where folly turned the greatest army in the world into a struggling mob. This was the nature of the battle, a clash of doctrines, a collision between pride and discipline, between the illusions of a king who thought himself unstoppable and the steel of men who knew how to fight as one. For days, Thermopylae echoed with the screams of Persians dying for a ruler who had led them into disaster, while the Spartans and their allies stood firm, turning the narrow pass into a monument of defiance. For days, Xerxes had thrown his best troops against the Greek line and gained nothing but humiliation. The narrow pass continued to bleed his army, and the Spartans stood unbroken. But Xerxes' fortune changed not through his own brilliance, but through betrayal. A Greek named Ephialtes, driven by greed and perhaps by the promise of reward, revealed to the Persians a hidden mountain trail. This path wound around the cliffs above Thermopylae and led to the rear of the Greek position. What brute force could not achieve, treachery made possible. When Xerxes learned of this, he seized the opportunity. He ordered his men to march under cover of darkness along the hidden trail. The climb was steep, but the promise of finally breaking the Greek resistance drove the soldiers forward. At dawn, as the mist lifted, the Persian army emerged behind the defenders. The Spartans were no longer shielded by the narrow pass. They were surrounded, trapped between two armies with no escape. The news of the betrayal reached Leonidas before the Persians closed in. Scouts and allies warned him that the Persians were moving through the mountains. Leonidas understood at once that the position was lost. He could have ordered a retreat, saving his men to fight another day, but that was not the Spartan way. For Spartans, honor outweighed life, and retreat was worse than death. Leonidas chose instead to stand and fight to the last, to turn a defeat into an act of defiance that would echo through history. Leonidas dismissed most of the Greek allies who had fought with him. He sent them away so that they could live to fight again. Only the Spartans, the Thespians, and a few Thebans stayed. Those who remained knew they were walking into death. There would be no rescue, no relief, no hope of victory. But their presence at the pass had already changed the war. By holding out as long as they had given Greece precious time to prepare. By dying now, they would give Greece a storious symbol of resistance, so powerful that it would inspire generations. The morning of the final stand was unlike the days before. The Persians came with renewed confidence, knowing their enemy was surrounded. But the Spartans did not tremble. They prepared as they always had, polishing their armor, combing their hair, and tightening their shields. To outsiders, such calm seemed strange, almost insane. But for Spartans, death in battle was not something to fear. It was the highest honor. The last fight began with ferocity. The Spartans charged into the Persians, no longer content to hold the line. They sought to inflict as much damage as possible before the end. Their long spears splintered after repeated thrusts, and when the spears broke, they drew their short swords. When swords shattered, they fought with daggers, and when even those were gone, they used their hands, their helmets, and their teeth. Every Spartan became a storm of defiance, each one determined to kill until he was killed. The Persians, despite their numbers, struggled. They expected broken men, desperate for survival. Instead, they faced warriors who fought with the clarity of those who had accepted death. The ferocity of the Spartans turned the battlefield into chaos. Even surrounded, they inflicted terrible losses. The Persian army, meant to crush them quickly, was again forced to pay in blood. At the center of it all was Leonidas. The Spartan king fought at the front, refusing to stand apart from his men. He killed many Persians before he himself was struck down. His death sent shockwaves through both armies. For the Spartans, it was the signal that the end had come. But it also hardened their resolve. For the Persians, it was both a triumph and a grim reminder of how costly this battle had been. The fighting did not stop with Leonidas' fall. The Spartans fought over his body, determined not to let the Persians carry it away. Herodotus tells us that they fought like lions, surrounding their fallen king, driving back wave after wave of attackers. Even as exhaustion set in, they refused to give ground. Only when they were overwhelmed by sheer numbers and rained with arrows did the last of them fall. In that final moment, the Persians gained the pass, but it was a hollow victory. The cost had been immense, the humiliation unforgettable. They had needed betrayal, overwhelming numbers, and the death of every Spartan to win a strip of land. What should have been a swift conquest had turned into a slow, bloody grind. And what should have been a demonstration of Persian power had become instead a testament to Greek defiance. The betrayal of Ephialtes was the turning point of Thermopylae, but it was not the end of the story. If anything, it was the beginning of something far greater. By standing to the last, the Spartans created a symbol that would outlive them. Their sacrifice was not forgotten by their allies, nor by their enemies. Xerxes may have taken the pass, but Leonidas and his men had taken immortality. The image of a small band of warriors fighting to the death against impossible odds burned itself into Greek memory. The betrayal that made their defeat possible only added to the story. Without Ephialtes, the Persians might never have won at all. Without betrayal, Xerxes might never have gained even a symbolic victory. But betrayal could not erase the reality of what the Spartans had done. Instead, it amplified it, making the story of Thermopylae not just about courage, but about sacrifice in the face of treachery. And so, the name of Ephialtes became infamous, a word synonymous with traitor in Greek culture. He gained whatever short-lived reward Xerxes promised him, but in history he was remembered not as a man of power, but as a coward who sold out his countrymen. His betrayal gave Xerxes a tactical win, but it could not erase the strategic disaster of the Persian invasion. What Xerxes thought was a victory was, in reality, the beginning of his downfall. Thermopylae had revealed the limits of Persian power, and the betrayal of Ephialtes had shown that brute force could not conquer without corruption. The Persians moved forward, but Greece was now united, fueled by rage and inspired by the memory of those who had fought and died in that narrow pass. The betrayal ended the stand at Thermopylae, but it ensured that the Spartan sacrifice would echo louder. They had chosen death over surrender, and in doing so, they had given Greece a story that would turn the tide of the war. The Battle of Thermopylae, though lost on the field, became one of the most defining moments in Western history. Xerxes had forced his way through the pass, but the cost was enormous. And the memory of what happened there outlived his temporary victory. For the Greeks, the stand at Thermopylae was not a tale of defeat, but of moral triumph. It was proof that courage, discipline, and unity could resist even the largest empire on earth. The Persians had brought the greatest army ever assembled. Ancient sources speak of hundreds of thousands of men, though modern historians debate the exact numbers. Even if the figure was exaggerated, the Persian army was still vast, drawn from every corner of the empire. Against them, the Greeks fielded only a few thousand, and of those, just 300 Spartans became the central figures of the story. The contrast was staggering, an ocean of soldiers crashing against a stone wall of determination. Thermopylae showed that numbers alone do not guarantee victory. The Persians had numbers, but the Spartans had something more dangerous: discipline and training. The phalanx, with its overlapping shields and long spears, created a wall of steel that held the pass for days. The Persians, accustomed to open-field maneuvering and massed archery, were unprepared for such close-quarters fighting. The narrow terrain stripped away their advantage, forcing them into a fight on Greek terms. For Greece, this realization was powerful. Before Thermopylae, the city-states were divided, suspicious of one another, and reluctant to join forces. Athens, Sparta, Corinth, and the smaller cities often quarreled as much as they cooperated. But the sacrifice of Leonidas and his men gave them a common story, a shared cause. If 300 Spartans could resist the Persian tide, then surely all of Greece united could do the same. The morale effect of Thermopylae cannot be overstated. While Xerxes continued his march and even burned Athens, the spirit of resistance had already been lit. Thermopylae was proof that the Persians could be stopped, that their army was not invincible. It showed that, with clever use of terrain, discipline, and determination, the Greeks could turn their weaknesses into strengths. In the months that followed, that belief bore fruit. At the naval battle of Salamis, the Greeks lured Xerxes' massive fleet into the narrow straits and destroyed it. At Plataea, the combined Greek armies met the Persians in open battle and defeated them decisively. These victories were built on the foundation laid at Thermopylae, where a small group of men bought time and inspired a nation. Thermopylae also became a defining cultural symbol. The sacrifice of the Spartans was remembered not just as a military event, but as a moral lesson. It was the idea that freedom is worth dying for, that courage can outshine numbers, and that honor can live longer than empires. Herodotus tells us of the famous epitaph carved at the site. "Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here obedient to their laws, we lie. Those words were more powerful than Xerxes' army, and they have survived for centuries. For the Persians, Thermopylae was meant to be a warning to all who resisted their empire. But instead, it became a warning to tyrants everywhere. Xerxes had every advantage, wealth, numbers, and resources, but his arrogance led him into a trap where those advantages meant nothing. His victory was empty, his losses immense, and his legacy overshadowed by the courage of the men he defeated. The Spartans did not win the battle, but they won the story. And in history, stories often matter more than numbers. The story of Thermopylae shaped not just the outcome of the Persian wars, but the identity of Greece itself. United by sacrifice, the Greeks fought on, secured their independence, and built a civilization whose ideas, democracy, philosophy, art, and science would shape the Western world. Thermopylae remains a symbol of defiance in the face of overwhelming odds. It has been remembered, retold, and reimagined countless times, from ancient inscriptions to modern films. But at its heart, it is the story of a few men who stood where they could not win, and by doing so, gave their people the chance to win everything. Xerxes crossed the pass, but Leonidas crossed into legend. Thermopylae was not a Persian triumph. It was a Greek awakening, and it was the moment that showed the world how a disciplined few could change the fate of nations. So, when we talk about Thermopylae, we are not just talking about a battle. We are talking about a defining moment in history, one that proved arrogance can bring down an empire, that courage can rally a people, and that sacrifice can shape the course of civilization. And that is why the stand at Thermopylae still matters today. Not as a defeat, but as the beginning of a victory that changed the world. If you enjoyed this breakdown of one of history's greatest blunders and its unexpected legacy, don't forget to like the video, drop a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to Dumb Historian for more tales of arrogance, mistakes, and the dumb decisions that shaped history.